Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come. That your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in every one, whereby in them ye may be a blessing, and make the witness of God in them to bless you.
In this podcast, we are continuing to read from The Eye of Faith, A History of Ohio Yearly Meeting, Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr. We are beginning Part 2 of The Eye of Faith. Part 2 has 3 chapters. Chapter 7 is A Wider Quakerism, 1917 to 1929. Chapter 8 is A Second World War and Wider Service, 1930 to 1950. Chapter 9 is Growth and Change, 1950 to the 1970s. On this podcast, we'll start reading Chapter 7, A Wider Quakerism, 1917 to 1929. The guns of August in 1914 in Europe were to reverberate worldwide. Quakers could not help but be affected. In Ohio Yearly Meeting and the other 6 conservative yearly meetings, Christian pacifist convictions were severely tested. When America entered the Great War, young friends and older friends, male and female, closed ranks and worked together. During the times of crisis in 1917 and afterward, friends found that they had the courage and the voice to speak their convictions, and the newly formed American Friends Service Committee provided them with a new outlet for this idealism. Cooperation with Quakers in other yearly meetings and other branches of Quakerism, as well as a new international outlook, were to bring a permanent change to Ohio Yearly Meeting. Officially, some of these changes came very slowly, but on the actual and unofficial level, they became increasingly obvious and irreversible during the 1920s. By the time the United States declared war on April 6, 1917, Ohio's Meeting for Sufferings and some of its more active members had long been working to prevent the slide into militarism and war. On at least 7 occasions between 1910 and 1917, the Meeting for Sufferings had sent communications to officials in Ohio, Washington, and even in foreign lands, and several Ohio Quaker delegations had actually gone to Washington. Twice during that time, the message were handed personally to the President of the United States. In 1915, the Meeting for Sufferings published 5,000 copies of Minister Jesse Edgerton's pamphlet, Militarism, the Curse of the Nations. Another minister, James Henderson, laid an urgent concern before his monthly and quarterly meeting at Stillwater in Barnesville, late in 1915. As recorded in his journal, this quote: "When the meeting closed, the committee met, and I told them the first thing to be considered was the visit to Washington, for the words to me on that part of the concern seemed to make haste. So they decided to send a night letter by wire to the private secretary that evening by one of their number. The reply came at noon next day, was read to me by phone, which was, owing to the present incident upon the opening of Congress, it would be impossible to arrange an opportunity. My first thought was, I will be excused. But immediately came the rejoinder, No, there will be a way. I then asked the committee to meet that afternoon, which it did. It was a solemn occasion and silent exercise until I felt to say, although it might seem presumptuous, yet I feel resigned to go to Washington if one of them would be willing to accompany me and see what might open. The committee yielded to the suggestion, and one of them offered, and we started that evening, reaching there the next morning. Having been somewhat acquainted with the city, we looked up our representative, David A. Hollingsworth of Cadiz, Ohio. He communicated by telephone with the President and Secretary, and with some resolution pressed the importance of our meeting to the President. An arrangement was made for the second day at 10:30 a.m. As Hollingsworth had succeeded in arranging for the opportunity, he would be expected to accompany us, which we highly approved. This arrangement was made on the seventh day, p.m. On first day, had meeting by ourselves, and in the afternoon called on a few friends. Next morning, after breakfast, had a quiet sitting in our room, during which I felt to kneel, craving strength and wisdom, that we might be enabled to perform whatever service might be called for this day, that we might in no way dishonor his blessed cause. On arising, felt relieved and more calmed. Near the time appointed we met D.A. Hollingsworth at the New Willard Hotel, and he accompanied us to the White House, arriving there about 9:30, waiting until about 10, during which many called, amongst a delegation from Texas, to see the President. We were then asked to fall in line and pass into the presence. DAH took the lead. When we approached the President, DAH introduced us, after which I asked permission to speak. It was granted. I then said, "Beloved President, greatly beloved for thy work's sake, thus saith the Lord God unto thee, O President, I raised thee up and exalted thee to the presidency of this republic for a special purpose, even though this might be an instrument in my hand for the preservation of the nation at a time of trouble. And now, after having been so signally blessed by my providence, why shouldst thou settle down in carnal security, relying upon the puny arm of flesh for protection? The plan of national defense, though apparently necessary in the eye of carnal wisdom, should it be carried into effect, should be in my hands as though before the fire. No nation was ever saved by the multitude or strength of its armed forces, but by my own interposition on behalf of those who trusted in and served me. They that trust in me shall be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever. As I ceased to speak, there was a little pause. When the President thanked me, reached out his hand, when I bid him farewell, several reporters then accosted us, asking our names and addresses and what I had said. The former we gave, but not the latter. Ending the quote from the journal and continuing with the text of the book. Olney's commencement week, held at the end of May 1917, was an active time. Many of the same friends attended the boarding school committee, the meeting for sufferings, and the alumni association. The meeting for sufferings set up a special committee for peace related work, which would become very active as the service committee. On the same day, the meeting issued an address to the membership, especially to prepare the young men for the trials ahead. 2 evenings later, the Olney Alumni Association heard Charles Livesey, clerk of the Meeting for Sufferings, and member of the new service committee, report on their proceedings. The meeting then discussed the sober prospects of the military draft, which would apparently have no provisions for conscientious objectors. The alumni gathering decided to hold a general meeting of friends at some central point to consider these matters further. Less than a month later, on Tuesday, June 26, 75 autos brought 375 young people to Harlem Springs, halfway between Salem and Barnesville, for the first halfway picnic. After a basket lunch in the old Harlem Academy dining room, the crowd went into the auditorium for a program at which several people spoke about what lay ahead for the Society of Friends. Like the Alumni Association and the Wilbur Union, this picnic was managed by younger and more liberal friends outside of the official structure of the yearly meeting. It was therefore much more responsive to the concerns for action and change than an official event might have been. Happily, not all of the older or more conservative friends stayed away. Jesse Edgerton, a member of the New Peace Committee and a minister, read a paper stressing the need for young friends and older friends to work together. Jacob Mall, a beloved minister from Coleraine, also spoke from the platform. He entered into the spirit and objects of the meeting with such rare sympathy, feeling that we felt his address added much to the interest of the occasion. His remark that older friends were simply there out of tolerance brought out some deciding remonstrance in the audience, indication that the young people want the help and cooperation of their older and more experienced friends. And continuing with the text, Wetherell Houghton, the only principal and clerk of the New Peace Committee, was also present and read a letter from L.J. Tabor, who could not attend. The halfway picnic had come into being at just the right time. Now that the automobile was in general use, it would provide a social religious fellowship that would help sustain friends in the face of World War I. The materialism of the 1920s and the slowness of the official yearly meeting. The picnic would be an important summer event for the next 40 years. The official yearly meeting of 1917 quickly responded to the government's announced plan for national mobilization. By August 7th, the Meeting for Suffering Special Committee had appointed an advisor in each quarterly meeting to assist young men who were to be drafted. They reported conferring with several young men and meeting with local draft boards. At yearly meeting about a month later, a special evening meeting was held in the boys' schoolroom for the young men of draft age. They, their fathers, and members of the special committee fitted the room for earnest discussions. It was, said Dilwyn Stratton later, the first time when young friends at Ohio yearly meeting really came forth with the expression of their individual convictions and reflecting on the irony that the greatest burdens would fall on those who had been given the least responsibility in the Society of Friends. He added, perhaps our older friends should acknowledge that they have been too fearful in sharing the cares of the church with those in their early 20s, that they have allowed them to occupy the back benches. Meanwhile, a group of girls and women were meeting in the girls' dormitory parlor to consider what they might do, recognizing that in spite of rising costs and wartime shortages, the farmer and his family are about the last people who would really suffer for food and clothing. They decided they were ideally placed to try to do something about the suffering in the world. They set up sewing circles in each neighborhood to work for war sufferers. One woman said at the meeting, I wish I might give a little vision. We seemed to get, as we met that evening, the wonderful opportunity for service seemed to open before us. 4 days after yearly meeting had ended on September 13th, 1917, Carl Patterson and Joseph Stratton, members of the Meeting for Suffering Service Committee, were on their way to Washington, where they presented the Quaker concerns to the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the President, and the state senator. Near the end of October, 2 members of the committee visited Camp Sherman, where they found our 4 boys doing non-combatant work at the base hospital, as they had a valid Form 174, which qualified them as conscientious objectors. 2 of them were driving ambulances. 1 was doing nursing, and 1 worked in the kitchen. Still, they were somewhat uneasy about doing any military work, and they declared themselves ready to refuse even this non-combatant military cooperation. The visiting friends were able to meet with the camp's commander, who assured that the boys would be treated kindly if they refused to work. Eventually, 3 of them did refuse to work and were placed in a segregated unit with Mennonites and others who refused to work. A peace of mind came to these 3, and they felt a load lifted off their shoulders when they made the stand. They felt like the officers had treated them as well as could be expected, a few harsh words being all they had to take from them. The relatively mild problems faced by these 4 men during their early days of mobilization illustrate both the confusion and the opportunity presented by a new legal category, conscientious objector. For the first time in history, 2 nations, the United States and England, had reluctantly granted some form of recognition to those whose objection to war was found on conscience and religious scruple. Although England had granted total exemption to its conscientious objectors, the tribunals which decided upon the man's sincerity were very hard to convince, so that scores of British objectors were imprisoned during the war. British friends were able to send a conscientious objector ambulance unit to the war zone, however, and later sent conscientious objector reconstruction teams. The American Selective Service Law granted non-combatant status only to bona fide members of certain religious denominations, Quakers among them. Unlike more recent draft laws, the 1917 law made a provision for conscientious objector only after they had been inducted into the Army and had arrived at camp. Here, they could fill out a Form 174, which, if validated, entitled them to non-combatant work under the regular Army. However, the traditional peace churches, including Ohio Yearly Meeting, believed that any significant cooperation with military system was wrong. Thus, each young friend drew the line where he must and suffered accordingly. As officers and fellow draftees confronted as unexpected threats to the system, usually the ridicule and sometimes with violence. Some conscientious objectors would not wear the uniform. Some would not drill. Some would not hold a gun. Some refused all work, even in the hospital. Fortunately, as early rulings of the War Department declared that qualified conscientious objectors were membership in the proper denominations, could be placed in segregated units where they would not be required to do anything contrary to their conscience. Another ruling that exempted Mennonites from wearing military uniforms, drilling, and so on was later extended to all valid conscientious objectors. Apparently, the interpretation of these regulations varied widely from camp to camp and from officer to officer. Charles Livesey, who must have been very active on the special committee, wrote in 1919, "Yet no personal abuse had been noted at Camp Sherman, beyond forcible uniforming, cold shower baths, bread and water diet, detention, or stockade. In some other camps, a conscientious objector fared very much worse." A few friends were summarily and arbitrarily court-martialed and sentenced to Leavenworth for varying periods. The inhumane and brutal treatment, equaling the atrocities of Inquisition, that they were meted out to some of the conscientious objectors and others here, was finally known at Washington, D.C. An impartial investigation resulted in speedy discharge of some of the officers and an order demanding an amelioration of such conditions. In his report, Charles noted that there were about 4,000 conscientious objectors in the camps, and that about 3/4 of them accepted non-combatant service. However, not all conscientious objectors fared so well as the religious objectors. As late as 1922, the Olney Courier reminded its reader that 300 American conscientious objectors were still in prison. During 1918, the Representative Meeting's Special Committee kept up its strenuous activity. The word committees known. Some of its members visited Camp Sherman several times to confer with men in the regular camp and with those who were now in a segregated unit in the hospital. In spite of the committee's strong conviction that any cooperation with the Army was wrong, they reported, "We have endeavored, however, to be very careful to allow the young men to decide these momentous questions for themselves without undue encouragement from us." During the early 1918, the committee found the 90 men of various denominations in the segregated unit at the hospital. These very interesting young men of staunch, clean character were not free to walk about the base, but they were permitted hikes to the westward so long as they appeared at meal and roll calls. They spent the day in study and discussion, and the members of the committee held several meetings for worship with them. By spring, the special committee had approved printing of 3 communications: Open Letter to Our Membership by Jesse Edgerson in February, and in April, a reaffirmation of the belief of friends regarding war, and Message of Encouragement to Our Membership, especially those of draft age. Through visits and correspondence, the committee found that in April of 1918, the segregated unit at Camp Sherman had been removed from the hospital, and its major benign control to restrict segregated tent section from which there could be no more hikes, and where the men prepared their own meals. After this, the incoming draftees at Camp Sherman were tested out rather fierce and fast amid the followers in the regular barracks by ridicule, persuasion, threats, or flattery before being sent to the segregated conscientious objector detachment, where there were 125 to 175 at a time. Here, a tactful and considerate captain was able to persuade many to go back to non-combatant or regular service. Those who remained in the unit were interviewed by the War Department's Special Board of Inquiry, which passed on each man's sincerity, recommending a farm furlough for most and friends reconstruction work in France for some. In late 1918 or early 1919, 2 members of the special committee visited Camp Taylor, Kentucky, Camp Gordon, Georgia, and Camp Jackson, South Carolina, as there had been reports of bad treatment there. Later, even though the war had ended, they visited Camp Sherman twice more to assist one man undergoing special trials as well as others about to be discharged. A final problem to be worked out was that some men's discharges were delayed because they refused to sign the Army's payroll and accept a payment. The special committee gave their last report to the Meeting for Sufferings at yearly meeting in 1919 and asked to be allowed to lay down their charge. Many friends believed that yearly meeting in 1919 was the best yearly meeting they had ever attended, according to Ruth Balderston. It was, of course, the first session after the close of the war. The time of testing had welded us together, and young and old had been deeply stirred. The visible evidence of the effect on the younger members was the great interest in attendance of meetings both through the day and at the evening meeting at the school. On Sunday, September 14th, the second day of the 6-day yearly meeting, both sides of the great yearly meeting house were nearly filled with members, visitors from several states in Canada and local Barnesville people. On the facing benches on the left side of the partition were many plain bonneted older women friends, while plainly dressed older men filled the facing benches on the right. The body of the meeting and the balconies were occupied by younger and middle-aged people, some of them plain or somewhat plain. Only a very few people under 30 dressed in Quaker plain by 1919. Families with children were separated, of course, by sex, except that infant boys would be with their mothers. Not all the people attending yearly meeting could stay at the boarding school. Many of the others stayed in the many Quaker homes near Barnesville or Quaker City. The advent of the automobile had made it possible for some to commute from meetings like Flushing, Short Creek, that's in Harrisville, or Coleraine. For lunch, on the big days of the yearly meeting, Saturday and Sunday, there might be 2 or 3 sittings in the boarding school dining room before all guests had been fed. Of course, many local friends went home and took a full table of guests with them, and some still followed this old practice of having a picnic lunch on the meeting grounds. Deep, powerful, and impressive worship and ministry occurred at the meeting house each day of yearly meeting, and all the important decisions were made, or at least ratified there. It was at the school, however, that one could see another, perhaps more dynamic side of Ohio yearly meeting. It was still true in 1919 that virtually no one under 30, unless he wore the plain Quaker garb, would presume to speak in a business meeting. Thus, the great decisions of the yearly meeting sessions were made without any voice or comment by a large segment of the body. But it was different at the meetings held in the evening down the walk at the school. At formal sessions of the Olney Alumni Association, the Educational Association, and the Aid Association, as well as other gatherings, young and middle-aged friends who seldom spoke, if at all, on the Hill, could open windows to the wider society of friends and the International Quaker Concern for Peace and Service. At these evening meetings, which were never reported in the yearly meeting minutes, and which were only sometimes mentioned in the Olney Current, visitors representing the American Friends Service Committee and other Quaker concerns would be encouraged to speak. Some of the more conservative friends never attended such meetings on principle, and so remained aloof of the ideas generated there. Many of the leading friends, however, including ministers like Carl Patterston and Jesse Edgerton, and plain friends like Charles Livesey and James Walton, did attend with interest and support. That there were strains which tested the new harmony of the immediate post-war years can be inferred from 2 circumstance references by the meeting of sufferings. We were dipped into a lively exercise by presentation of paper referring to conditions in our society as connected with Young Friends movement. The paper was referring to a committee which deleted a few phrases and presented it to a later session. But the meeting could not unite on action. Instead, they agreed to pass from further consideration of this paper at present, after approving, writing a minute saying that they were desirous that the ardor of youth and the caution of age may be so fused and forged on the anvil of divine love that we may be one in true Christian fellowship. Apparently, there could be no official recognition that the Young Friends conferences to be held nationally and internationally during those years. The same Olney Current in which Ruth Balderston had written so glowingly about the 1919 yearly meeting also contained hints of younger friends' pressure for change in the yearly meeting. For example, there was a letter from young Albert Livesey, who was doing American Friends Service Committee reconstruction work in France, urging the yearly meeting to really address the problems of the world. There was a poem from Young Friends News Bulletin. Ohio Yearly Meeting would not officially recognize or sanction Younger Friends organization in Ohio or elsewhere for many more years. And finally, there was a short appeal by Shara Bracken to dear, zealous friends of Ohio Yearly Meeting, in which she compared literalists and traditionalists of Ohio Yearly Meeting to the Pharisees at the time of Jesus. Yet, Ruth Balderson is undoubtedly correct in writing that a spirit of overall harmony did prevail and that the interests of the young people were greater than before, as meetings through the week were filled with loving tolerance. She concluded, the deepest chords were touched at the closing session of the yearly meeting when the shutters, which separate the men and the women, were opened, and we were all bowed together under the weight of the gospel love, which one of our members, James Henderson, was to carry out to Germany and other war-torn lands. This concludes the reading of the beginning of chapter 7, A Wider Quakerism, 1917 to 1929 in the Eye of Faith, a history of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr. We will finish reading chapter 7 in the next podcast. The words in our introduction were written by George Fox in 1656 in a letter to friends in the ministry. The music was composed and sung by Paulette Meyer. More information at her website, www.paulettemeyer.com.
Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in every one, whereby in them ye may be a blessing, and make the witness of God in them to bless you.